Envy is ignorance. Imitation is suicide. Is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood. And Socrates and Jesus and Luther.
I wrote this book that we designed together on the subject of self-reliance when I was not only away from my teaching duties, because I was in lockdown in Los Angeles, but I was away from my children. And I started to think about children everywhere, and I started to think about students everywhere, and I wanted to write a book for them, inspired by this marvelous essay written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, white male privileged 19th century philosopher whose works are epic. But I think in this particular instance, this essay really resonated with me and with you, I think.
What was it about that essay that you felt was applicable to this moment, despite all of those cultural differences?
I think in a world where consensus is such a strong driving force in industry, in the economy, on creative teams, I thought it's high time we turn to someone for whom consensus was actually evil.
It's funny that we take this essay that's over 100 years old and designed it in such a modern, a modern way. And the typefaces themselves, I think it's important to note, have special meaning in the text and in your history and in our history. So the main book, the book of Emerson's text, is set in a typeface called Emerson.
Right.
And then your essays and your kind of commentary and responses are set in Neuhaus Unica, which I guess is like the official Design Observer typeface.
Correct. I wrote this book and we designed this book in a year of incredible social tumult, where questions of what is accessible and what is legible, and legibility, not just in terms of typography, but cultural legibility, right?
Yeah.
But I think interpretation of what an American, the resonance of an American individualist voice land differently for European readers. And so being conscious of that, again, at a moment when we're watching the George Floyd world unfurl in unprecedented ways, it makes you think about the choice of a typeface in a way that's completely different. What does access really mean? What does inclusivity really mean? But to come back to the crisis of the individual, I mean, there's no more pertinent essay, I think, than this one to really stop and think about what the world means to you.
There's something very contemporary, very 21st century in the construction of the book itself, in that you can read his entire essay all the way through in the first part of the book, but we broke it up through these big kind of illustrative block quotes, but then also previewed your essays that appear at the end, which you could almost think of as kind of extended footnotes.
The fact that we have the main text in justified type, which most people don't like to do. It feels like a very 19th century thing to do. My essays, which all appear at the end of the book, are all aligned on the baseline, which is like setting something flush right, rag left. But I thought if he was grounded in the column that was justified type, then my essays could be grounded by being anchored to the bottom of the page. Many moving parts, and yet the logic of it really, I think, became clear to us as we went through, the more we actually isolated these dimensions. And this brings us to the topic of the end papers.
If this is a book of contrasts of old and new, 19th century, 21st century, serif, sans serif, black, white, this is probably the biggest contrast in the entire book. Then visually also, we took the letter I from both typefaces, Emerson and Neuhaus Unica.
So I think it also speaks a little bit to the cover. We went through many drafts of the color. I think this was in some ways a painful process, but a really educational one. This isolation on the cover of the I was something that we wanted to carry into the end papers. Very often, end papers are like the overture to a symphony. It has to say something about the book without giving the book away.
It feels like a modern William Morris, all that ornamentation and nature that would be on his books, around the edges of those like illuminated manuscripts. This is like the 21st century version of that, but instead of flowers and vines, it's loading signs.
Nature was so important to Emerson and the 19th century book design that would have followed him through his prolific years as a published author. And I like that you said William Morris, who of course was a Brit, and this is an American writer. So I think even more we have a dialogue between centuries and between continents.